Fire investigation is a science, or it is supposed to be. For most of the 20th century, it was treated as a science by people who did not fully understand it. Practitioners who had developed rules of thumb, passed down through decades of fire investigation work, that seemed logical and felt reliable and were, in significant measure, wrong. These rules had names: alligator charring, pour patterns, the V pattern, low burn indicators. Each one was a supposed marker of arson, a sign. Experienced investigators would testify with authority in courtrooms across America that a fire had been deliberately set rather than accidentally started. The problem, which the scientific community began to document seriously in the 1990s, and which is now thoroughly established, is that most of these indicators can be produced by accidental fires under the right conditions. They are not reliable markers of arson. They never were. Patricia Hensley learned this the hard way. On a January night in 2001, a fire destroyed her home in Knoxville, Tennessee. Her 2 children, aged 4 and 6, died in the fire. Patricia survived. She had been asleep and woken to smoke and had tried to reach her children, and could not, and had escaped through a window and collapsed on the front lawn and watched her house burn. 6 weeks later, she was arrested for their murder. The evidence against her was entirely the testimony of a fire investigator who pointed to patterns in the burn damage and said, "This fire was set deliberately, and it was set from inside the home, and the most likely person to have set it was the person who survived." Patricia Hensley would spend 18 years in a Tennessee prison before the scientific community caught up with the investigation that had destroyed her life. Patricia Hensley was 33 years old in January 2001. She worked as a medical receptionist at a family practice clinic in Knoxville, a job she had held for 7 years and was good at. She was known by her colleagues as warm and organized and slightly funny, in a dry way that people appreciated once they got past her initial reserve. She had 2 children, Emma, 6 years old, and Tyler, 4. Their father had left when Tyler was 18 months old and had not been reliably present since. Patricia was raising them alone, on a single income, in a rented 3-bedroom house on the east side of Knoxville that was modest but clean, and that she had made genuinely homely with the particular effort of a woman who understands that a good home is something you build rather than something that arrives. She was not wealthy. She was not struggling. She was managing, which is a more honest description of most people's lives than either extreme. By all accounts from people who knew her, colleagues, neighbors, the parents of her children's friends, she was a devoted mother. Not conspicuously so, not in the performed way that people sometimes note and then retract under questioning. Simply devoted in the ordinary sense. Present, consistent, engaged with her children's lives in the way that becomes visible only in its absence. On the night of January 14, 2001, she put her children to bed at 8:30, watched television for 2 hours, fell asleep on the sofa, and woke to smoke. That is her account. It never changed. Not in the initial police interview, not in the weeks that followed, not across 18 years of imprisonment, not at any point in the legal process that eventually freed her. It was the truth. It would take 18 years to establish that. The fire began, according to the eventual scientific reconstruction, in the living room. The most probable cause, established nearly 2 decades later by fire scientists using methods unavailable or not applied in 2001, was an electrical fault in a power strip behind the sofa, which had been in place for 3 years and showed signs of where that predated the fire. The fire spread quickly because the house was older, because the furnishings were standard foam-filled furniture of the kind that burns rapidly and produces heavy toxic smoke, and because the layout of the house channeled airflow from the living room toward the hallway and the children's bedrooms. Patricia woke when the smoke reached her. She said it was thick and low, and she could not see. She said she went toward the children's rooms. She said the hallway was already full of smoke, and she could not get through. She said she called their names and heard nothing. She said she went to the window, and it would not open properly, and she broke it and fell out, and the fall hurt her, and she lay on the lawn and screamed for help. The neighbors called emergency services. The fire department arrived in 7 minutes. They could not save the children. The fire investigation began the following morning. The lead fire investigator assigned to the case was a man named Harold Pruitt, who had been investigating fires for the Tennessee State Fire Marshal's Office for 19 years. He was experienced, respected, and thoroughly trained in the investigative methods that had been standard in his field for decades. He was also, though no fault of his own, working with a framework that science had already begun to challenge, but that had not yet been revised in the training and practice of working fire investigators. Harold Pruitt spent 2 days at the fire scene. He noted what he identified as poor patterns on the living room floor, irregular burn marks that, in the investigative tradition he had been trained in, indicated that an accelerant had been poured and ignited. He noted low burn indicators, burn damage occurring close to the floor level that the received wisdom of his training said was characteristic of accelerant-assisted fires. He noted a V pattern on the living room wall that he interpreted as consistent with a deliberately set origin point. He concluded that the fire had been deliberately set. He further concluded, based on what he called the pattern of the fire's spread and the location of the origin point relative to the exits, that the fire had been set by someone with knowledge of the house's layout, most probably someone who lived there. He filed his report 6 weeks after the fire. 2 days later, Patricia Hensley was arrested. What Harold Pruitt did not know, what the training he had received had not incorporated, was that the patterns he identified had since been tested in controlled burn experiments by fire scientists at research institutions, and that those experiments had shown the same patterns could be produced by fast-moving accidental fires in furnished residential rooms. The poor patterns were not poor patterns. They were the result of burning foam furniture and carpet, creating irregular heat pools. The low burn indicators were the result of oxygen-depleted post-flashover combustion. The V pattern was simply a V pattern, a natural result of heat rising and spreading. None of these findings had reached Harold Pruitt. They had not reached the prosecution. They had not reached the defense. They would not reach the courtroom for nearly 2 decades. The trial of Patricia Hensley opened in October 2001 and lasted 3 weeks. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each child. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Harold Pruitt's fire investigation testimony. He testified for 2 full days, presenting his findings with the authority of 19 years of experience and the confidence of a man who believed, genuinely, that what he was saying was correct. The defense challenged the fire investigation methodology. They brought in their own fire investigator, who questioned some of Pruitt's conclusions. The prosecution countered with Pruitt's experience and credentials. The jury heard 2 experts disagree. In 2001, the scientific critique of traditional fire investigation methodology was present in the academic literature, but had not yet reached the point where it was widely known to criminal defense attorneys or reflected in the practice of most working fire investigators. The defense expert who testified for Patricia was challenging Pruitt's conclusions on methodological grounds, correctly as it turned out, but without the full weight of the subsequent scientific consensus behind him. The prosecution also presented evidence of Patricia's financial situation. She was behind on her rent, had some credit card debt, as potential motive, suggesting the insurance payout on the house contents might have been a factor. The house was rented, so there was no property insurance benefit. The contents insurance amounted to $12,000. The prosecution suggested this had been her motive. Patricia Hensley had allegedly murdered her 6-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son for $12,000. The jury accepted this theory. They deliberated for 4 days. They found Patricia guilty on both counts. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. She was 34 years old. She said nothing when the verdict was read. She did not cry. She looked straight ahead. Later she said that in that moment she went somewhere else in her mind, somewhere that the verdict could not reach, and that she did not come back to herself until she was in the transport vehicle, and by then there was nothing left to say. Patricia Hensley entered the Tennessee prison for women in November 2001. She was, from the beginning, unlike most of the other inmates in the specific quality of her wrongness. She had not made a bad decision, had not given in to an impulse, had not acted in anger or desperation. She had simply been in the wrong house on the wrong night, and the science used to investigate the tragedy had been wrong, and the result was 2 consecutive life sentences. She maintained her innocence from the first day. She said she had not set the fire. She said she had loved her children. She said Emma had been learning to read chapter books and Tyler had just figured out how to ride his bicycle without stabilizers 3 weeks before the fire. And she said these things not to make a case, but because they were the things she thought about. She filed appeals. They failed. The scientific critique of fire investigation methodology was not yet developed to the point where it could anchor a successful appeal. Her mother visited every month for the first 8 years. Then her mother's health declined. Then her mother died, in 2011 without seeing her daughter free. Patricia was permitted to attend the funeral under supervision, in handcuffs that were briefly removed at the graveside at the request of the funeral director. She had no other close family. She had former colleagues who wrote occasionally in the first years and then did not. She had, eventually, no one. In 2012, a Tennessee-based wrongful conviction organization called the Clear Truth Project agreed to review her case. They had been approached by a fire science professor at the University of Tennessee named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been following the development of the scientific critique of traditional fire investigation methodology, and who had identified Patricia's case as one where the original investigation appeared to rely heavily on the discredited indicators. Dr. Webb spent 2 years reconstructing the original investigation. What he found confirmed what he had suspected. Every indicator that Harold Pruitt had cited as evidence of arson could be explained by the documented behavior of accidental fires in similarly furnished residential spaces. Not one of Pruitt's conclusions was scientifically reliable. The house had not been deliberately set on fire. Patricia Hensley had not killed her children. The scientific reconstruction of the Hensley fire took 3 years to complete to the standard required for legal proceedings. Dr. Webb and his team conducted controlled burn experiments replicating the conditions of the Hensley house. Similar age, similar construction, similar furnishings. They documented the burn patterns produced by accidental fires under those conditions. They compared those patterns, point by point, with the patterns Harold Pruitt had cited as evidence of arson. The results were unambiguous. Every pattern Pruitt had identified was reproduced in accidental fires. The poor patterns, the low burn indicators, the V pattern, all of them appeared in fires that had been deliberately set under controlled conditions with no accelerant. The science of what Pruitt had testified to had been, not through malice but through the limitations of the field's knowledge at the time, simply wrong. In 2015, the Clear Truth Project filed a motion for a new trial on behalf of Patricia Hensley, supported by Dr. Webb's scientific findings, and by a growing body of case law, in which courts were beginning to grapple with the implications of the revised fire science for past convictions. The Tennessee courts, to their considerable credit, engaged seriously with the motion. The case moved through the appellate process over the next 2 years. In 2017, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals vacated Patricia Hensley's conviction, finding that the original fire investigation testimony had relied on methodology that had since been scientifically discredited, and that a properly informed jury might have reached a different verdict. The prosecution reviewed the case and declined to retry. The charges were dismissed. On March 3, 2019, Patricia Hensley walked out of the Tennessee Prison for Women. She was 51 years old. She had entered at 34. There was no family waiting. Her mother was dead. Her father had died before the fire. She had a former colleague, a woman named Janet, who had worked beside her at the medical clinic for 6 years before the arrest, and who had never stopped believing she was innocent, who had driven from Knoxville to be there. Janet had brought a change of clothes and a thermos of coffee and a folded piece of paper on which she had written down some things Patricia might need to know about the world that had changed in 18 years. How smartphones worked, what apps she would need, that everything was done online now, that the coffee shop they used to go to had closed and a different one had opened in the same building. Patricia read the list in the car. She read it very carefully, the way she did everything. Then she put it in her pocket and looked out the window at the Tennessee landscape and said, "I need to go to Emma and Tyler's grave." Janet drove her there. It was a cold March morning. The graves were in a small cemetery on the east side of Knoxville, not far from the house that no longer existed. There were flowers, fresh ones, placed by someone unknown. Patricia stood between the 2 small headstones for a long time. She did not speak. Later she said there was nothing to say that she had not been saying for 18 years, inside, in the place where she kept them. She said, "I just needed to be there. To stand there without handcuffs. That was all." Patricia Hensley's case is not unique in the landscape of fire investigation wrongful convictions. It is, unfortunately, one of a significant number. Since the early 2000s, fire scientists, particularly those working under the auspices of the National Fire Protection Association and the International Association of Arson Investigators, have systematically re-examined the theoretical foundations of traditional fire investigation methodology. The conclusions have been, for the field, genuinely humbling. Many of the indicators historically used to identify arson fires can be produced by accidental fires. The so-called science of fire investigation was, in significant measure, a body of practitioner lore that had never been subjected to rigorous experimental testing. When it was tested, much of it failed. The National Registry of Exonerations identifies arson cases as one of the categories most susceptible to wrongful conviction precisely because the forensic methodology has been so extensively revised. Since 1989, over 90 people in the United States have been exonerated of arson-related convictions, a number that many experts believe substantially understates the true figure, because many such cases never reach the review process. Harold Pruitt, the fire investigator whose testimony convicted Patricia, was never charged with any offense. He had testified in good faith to methods he had been trained to apply. The training was wrong. The field's knowledge was wrong. The legal system had accepted that testimony without the scrutiny it deserved. None of this made him legally responsible. None of this returned 18 years to Patricia Hensley. Patricia Hensley is 56 years old. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee, in a small apartment that she describes as the right size for someone learning to be alone in a new way. She returned to medical administration work, not without difficulty because a wrongful conviction on your record, even after exoneration, creates complications that the legal system does not always adequately resolve. She found, eventually, an employer willing to look at the full story rather than the first line of a background check. She received compensation from the state of Tennessee. The state wrongful conviction statute provided $50,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment, amounting to $900,000 for 18 years. She filed a civil lawsuit against the state and the fire marshal's office. The case was settled in 2021 for an undisclosed amount. She has become, quietly and without fanfare, an advocate for fire investigation reform. She has submitted written testimony to legislative committees considering updates to arson prosecution standards. She has spoken at legal conferences alongside Dr. Webb, who she describes as the person who gave her back her life. She has written, in a published essay, about what it means to have lost her children and then to have lost 18 years to a system that misunderstood what happened to them. She visits Emma and Tyler's graves every month. She brings fresh flowers. She does not stay long. She says what she has to say, and then she leaves, because she has learned that grief is not served by duration. It is served by return. She says she does not want pity. She says pity is for the living, and she is more interested in the dead. Specifically, in making sure that what happened to her children and to her is understood clearly enough that it does not happen to someone else. She says, the fire that killed Emma and Tyler was an accident. Accidents happen. What was not an accident was the system that looked at that fire and decided it needed someone to blame. That is a choice. And as long as the system is willing to make that choice on the basis of bad science, there will be more Patricias, more Emmas, more Tylers. She pauses when she says this. Then she says, the children deserve better than that. Even now. Especially now. Patricia Hensley's story is, in one sense, the simplest wrongful conviction story we have told on this channel. There was no corrupt detective. There was no lying informant. There was no eyewitness who misremembered. There was no brother who failed to come forward. There was a fire investigator who did his job as he had been trained to do it. There was a prosecution that relied on his testimony in good faith. There was a defense that challenged that testimony without the full weight of the eventual scientific consensus to support the challenge. There was a jury that heard two experts disagree and sided with the more experienced one. And in that chain of ordinary professional decisions, made by people who were mostly doing their jobs as they understood them, an innocent woman spent 18 years in prison for the murder of her own children. The lesson here is not that individual people were malicious. The lesson is harder than that. The lesson is that systems fail, that the science we use to determine guilt is not always as settled as we present it in courtrooms, that the confidence of an expert witness is not the same thing as the accuracy of expert testimony, that the legal system has a structural weakness in its relationship to scientific knowledge. It tends to adopt it too slowly and to let go of it even more slowly. Patricia Hensley's children died in a fire. She should have been allowed to grieve them as a mother, not imprisoned as a murderer. The people who imprisoned her were not monsters. They were professionals doing their jobs with flawed tools. And that, the ordinary institutional non-monstrous nature of how this happened, should worry us more than the monsters do. Because we have built systems to catch monsters. We have not built adequate systems to catch ourselves.